Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome. The purpose of the Practical SQL Server HA show is twofold. One, if you are a technical operator, meaning you're a database administrator, systems administrator, or sometimes the data analyst who happens to know a thing or two about SQL, and you just got voluntold to take care of the SQL Server databases, and you're responsible for the high availability and or disaster recovery solution for your SQL Server databases, welcome. This is for you because in general, high availability and or disaster recovery solutions are very, very, very complex, very difficult to manage, and sometimes you're the only person who needs to deal with it. You don't have a big team around you to help you navigate the complexity. And what's even worse is the very solution that is supposed to provide high availability is the one that's causing massive outages, and you don't know what to do, right? Again, I did say it's twofold. The second fold is for decision makers, whether you're a vice president of engineering, a director of IT, and you're evaluating a high availability solution for your SQL Server databases. And sometimes the CEO already made the decision to implement like always on availability groups, and you need to get your team ready for it. This is for you. We are still doing what I call the series on vendor recommendations, or what I call vendor dilemma, right? Vendor dilemma. This is where you're in that stage where the vendors are making recommendations when it comes to high availability solutions for your SQL Server databases. And I refer to vendors, Microsoft is a vendor. They are recommending high availability solutions for databases. Well, primarily they're the vendor for SQL Server. But they also have their own products, like, of course, on-premises. We're talking about on-premises deployments, sometimes even with cloud deployments when you're dealing with infrastructure as a service solution. System Center Configuration Manager, or the System Center Suite, uses SQL Server as a backend. SharePoint uses SQL Server as a backend, unless, of course, you decide you want to deploy SharePoint on Azure. What else? VMware is a vendor. They make recommendations on how you can protect your SQL Server databases when you're running SQL Server on a VMware infrastructure. Your ERP solutions vendor, your CRM solutions vendor, or although a lot of the CRM and the ERP systems are slowly, well, CRM, most of them are cloud-based nowadays. ERP, they're still doing ERP stuff on premises. But again, these are the types of vendors, and of course, including your managed services provider is a vendor. Your consulting company is a vendor. So they may have recommendations when it comes to implementing high availability solutions for your SQL Server databases. And just being aware of some of the misconceptions or some of the vendor recommendations when it comes to high availability solutions for your SQL Server. This is one of those days. But just being aware of their recommendations and why they're making those recommendations give you insights into how you can move forward. Like, does their recommendation make sense when it comes to having the right people, the complexity, solving the business needs, all of these things, and not just taking in vendor recommendations. Now, this episode is all about, again, still focusing on vendor recommendations when it comes to SQL Server high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. But I want to focus on what the vendors are not telling you, right? What vendors are not telling you. And what do I mean by what vendors are not telling you? When it comes to, let's say, the whole sales process, you're bringing in a new solution, you're implementing a solution, on-premises that is. Vendor comes in, they walk you through like the whole, I don't want to call it the sales cycle, but part of it is walking you through the implementation, and helping you as you cut over to production, part of the conversation would be, what about our databases, or what about high availability? Okay, they would have their own solution for high availability, and then for the databases, if they're using SQL Server, they would make recommendations when it comes to high availability solutions. Again, be that always on availability groups, failover clustered instances, or anything that they would make recommendations on. But whenever they come up with a recommendation, you also have to think about, hey, what else? Okay, go back to some of the previous videos that I've done, previous episodes, where I talk about some of the like the misconceptions. Okay, some of the things that are not covered by your a vendor when they're making recommendations as far as SQL Server high availability solutions are concerned. Now, I want to talk about this because this is something that would, I don't want to say make or break that deal, okay? Especially when you've already signed a contract and you're ready for implementation. But what vendors are not telling you when it comes to making their recommendations, well, again, make sure that you have your pen and paper ready. Let's start with the very first one. First one is support. Okay, what do I mean by support? Well, they're providing the software, they're providing the implementation services, but when it comes to support, what are they covering? Okay, normally and typically, product support does not mean support for the HA solution. Okay, so let's say, for instance, you asked for an HA solution for, I'll go back to the ERP system. You've implemented the ERP system. They have an architecture to implement high availability for their product. Okay, maybe a multi-tier application where you have a front end, a middle tier, and then your databases. They are supporting the application, okay, or the product. In this case, the ERP system. They're providing support for that. But when it comes to the high availability solution that they're recommending as far as support is concerned, well, typically what I've seen out in the field is it's best effort, okay? And normally here's how the process goes. The vendor make recommendations when it comes to high availability solutions for your databases. They would help you, okay, implement it. Sometimes they would say, oh, you go ahead and implement it. Okay. They connect their application to the SQL Server databases running on that high availability solution, and then, okay, something goes wrong on the application side, you call them, they provide support on the app side. Okay, they make sure that the application works fine, they tweak configuration settings, but when it comes to the databases, okay, when it comes to the back-end database, if something goes wrong, let's say, get an outage, normally, the way they help you with this is best effort, okay? Best effort. And best effort sometimes means call Microsoft. And it's interesting because I know you might be thinking, wait a second, what do you mean by that? Even within Microsoft, like the company in and of itself, even within Microsoft, and this is something that I've highlighted a couple of times in the past, when you're implementing something like an always-on availability group, that depends on another platform for high availability. Okay? It depends on the Windows Server failover clustering. Keep in mind, these are two different products. Okay? These are two different products, which means these are two different teams taking care of two different products. So when you pick up a phone and call Microsoft for support when it comes to always-on availability groups, they would look at it and say, hey, this is not a SQL Server problem. What we're going to do is we are going to bring in the people from the Windows Server failover clustering team to take a look at this. Okay? When you think about this, this is already your SQL Server high availability solution, and you're working with one vendor, Microsoft. But because Microsoft is so big, within Microsoft you have multiple teams taking care of multiple products. So the problem, the outage might be caused by something outside of SQL Server, and the SQL Server product team cannot help you with that. They would have to bring in, even if they know failover clustering inside out, because there might be some cases where the product team has to really take care of it. So they would bring in people, engineers from the Windows Server failover clustering product team into the mix to troubleshoot the issue. Okay, and that's why I said even within a Microsoft itself, even within a company, because it's so big, okay, product support for your high availability solution is decoupled because of the fact that SQL Server runs on another product to provide high availability. So you have to think about this, because when it comes to product support, your vendor is definitely, hopefully, going to help you with that. Okay, I've had several cases where you can't even make modifications or configuration changes on the back-end database because it renders it out of support. Literally, it renders it out of support. One example that I can use, again, I'm using Microsoft as an example here, is with SharePoint. You cannot even fix database corruption issues inside the SharePoint database, even though the fix is technically supported from a SQL Server point of view. Okay, so you got to think about that. Well, your vendor is not going to tell you about, product support versus HA solution support. Okay, and the approach would always be best effort. If they have capable engineers on board, if they have database administrators who know your SQL Server HA solution inside out, sure, they would. At the end of the day, you have to really understand that product support or app support is not the same as support for HA solution. Okay, they would recommend it, but that does not necessarily mean that they would support it. Okay, I say best effort because, again, at the end of, I always put myself in the shoes of the customer whenever I do this, and there is an outage. Whether the outage happens on the database side or on the app side, first point of contact will be the vendor. In this case, the app vendor. Okay, so I put myself in the shoes of the customer and go through the process of how would the support call would look like, and then try to understand what would the vendor provide as far as support is concerned, and what would Microsoft provide, and what you, if you're the DBA, the sys engineer, what kind of support you are going to provide. And this is also one of the things that I mentioned when it comes to officially supported. Okay, because you are going to have documentation from Microsoft when it comes to, so these are the different configuration settings that you need to implement in order for you to be officially supported. Like one of the things that Microsoft would ask whenever you call them in for product support when it comes to SQL Server is they would check for the cumulative updates. Are they up to date? Because if you're not up to date, and they know for a fact that the product issue has been fixed using a specific cumulative update, the first thing that they would tell you is implement this first. Okay. They want you to be in a fully supported state, meaning the configuration, the setting, everything else is supported, or according to their definition of what supported means, before they can even help you. The way I look at support is you, as the engineer, as the administrator, you are the first line of support. Okay, so officially supported, as far as I'm concerned, is you will officially support this when something goes wrong. Okay, so the layers of that, the person getting the ticket, the escalation to the app vendor, the escalation to Microsoft. I put myself in the shoes of the customer and understand what the process looks like to find out if there are gaps. Because again, the goal for implementing high availability solutions is to minimize outage, to meet your recovery point and recovery time objective. Okay, so that's the first one. Product support does not mean HA solution support. Your vendor might be recommending a high availability solution, but they're not necessarily be the one supporting it if something goes wrong. Okay. The next one, this is this one is what I sometimes I get asked about this, vendor recommended best practices do not magically apply to you. Okay? Vendor recommended best practices do not magically apply to you. There are several vendor recommended best practices. Every vendor will have its own. Like for instance, SQL Server, Microsoft will have a recommended best practices for implementing SQL Server. We're not even talking about high availability solutions, just generic implementation. Like in the past, they would make recommendations on the number of TempDB database files according to the CPU cores of your processor. They would make recommendations on perform volume maintenance tasks, permission or the instant file initialization. All of these they baked into the installation process to make it seamless as far as making their best practice recommendation already implemented. Okay? But the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is vendor recommended best practices are designed with several assumptions. For one, the assumption that they used is you, the customer, have Microsoft's resources in hand. I remember when Microsoft made recommendations about proper placement of database files. Database files, MDF versus LDF files, don't put them on C drive and make sure that you're separating your MDF files from your LDF files. MDF files are random reads and writes. LDF files are sequential reads and writes. So if you want optimum performance for that, you have to put them in separate physical drives and logical drives also for high availability and resilience. But that's, again, on the assumption that you have boatloads of money to implement a very complex disk subsystem or storage subsystem that follow Microsoft vendor recommended best practices. An example of this is one of my customers that I worked on a couple of years ago, where as I was doing an assessment of their environment, they're a global media company, and I found out that their databases are stored on a C drive. Yeah, C:\\MSQL, and that's where all of their databases are. And that's just for one server. I looked at the other servers. They have like 200 plus database servers across the infrastructure. They're all using C:\\MSQL. So their databases are stored on the C drive, which is a complete no-no if you're following Microsoft recommended best practices. I was lucky enough to not tell them that this is not a recommended best practices, or maybe I was just really curious. I asked the question, so why are you using this format across the entire infrastructure when it comes to your SQL Server databases? Okay? The explanation blew me away. And this was by far one of the most brilliant way of implementing their own best practices that do not necessarily follow Microsoft best practices. So what they did was they standardized on using mount points. Every single server in their enterprise, database server that is, for SQL Server, has a mount point that redirects to their high-end all-flash array. This is where the C:\\MSQL folder is mounted on. So even though it looks like the databases are sitting on the C drive, they're technically stored somewhere else. The beauty of this is because they standardized on this, it makes it easy for them to move database files around without taking a lot of downtime. It makes it easy to replicate the storage. It also makes it easy to standardize like automation processes. In fact, this was the key to when we were doing an entire data center migration. Happened in less than 40 plus minutes. They were expecting like a 6-hour downtime. We did it in less than 40 plus minutes because they standardized on having all of their databases on C:\\MSQL. That I thought initially was on a C drive. It looks like it's on the C drive, but it's technically on an expensive all-flash array somewhere. Okay? And again, this is why I said vendor recommended best practices is something that you also have to evaluate for yourself, your company, and your internal processes. You do not have Microsoft's engineers. You do not have their operational processes. You do not have their budget. Well, if you think about it, they're recommending at a minimum 3 replicas for your availability groups. Well, just look at how much that costs if you have like 256 core machine. Okay, so when a vendor makes a recommendation about high availability solution, let's go back to that example about an ERP system. They make recommendations. They have best practices on how to implement their product, and then they would just say, oh, use Microsoft's recommendation or best practices recommendation when implementing a high availability solution. Again, similar to the previous point of product support or app support does not necessarily mean high availability support. So the way you implement a high availability solution for your SQL Server databases while following Microsoft recommended best practices or the vendor's recommended best practices, and I'm talking about the app vendor, might not necessarily be applicable to you, because why would you do something like that when you have very limited resources and very limited skill set? So you have to reevaluate recommendations as, again, not just from the high availability solution point of view, but also from the recommended best practices point of view. Okay? So, again, point number 2, vendor recommended best practices don't magically apply to you. You have to reevaluate them according to what's best for your needs. And I'm really emphasizing this from the point of view of operational processes as well. Okay? Because you have to think about this. Just because Microsoft says, or your vendor says, you do it this way because it's best practice, you also have to evaluate, does this make sense? Like, again, that example of putting your databases on a C drive. Not the Microsoft best practice, but it works great for this specific organization. In fact, it is their recommended best practice. So anytime they read, oh, don't put your databases on a C drive, they just ignore it. Okay? Third thing, your app costs do not include HADR solution costs. Okay? Your app costs do not include your HADR solution costs. This is huge, especially as a lot of applications are built with SQL Server databases as their back-end databases. They kind of assume, and the vendor assumes, that you will provision a SQL Server instance for their app. That's one. Which means the cost, okay, I'm not concerned about the cost of the SQL Server instance. You, the customer, bears the cost of the implementation, meaning hardware, licensing, implementation, manpower, all that, that's on you. Okay? So when it comes to, and I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier about the whole sales process or the sales cycle. You're at that stage where, okay, we're buying the solution, this is how much it costs, and then you ask, what about high availability? Even when they make recommendations on the high availability solution for their app in and of itself, again, an ERP system, front end, middle tier, you bear the cost of provisioning the hardware, provisioning the networking to tie those. So say, for instance, you want to implement a load balanced solution, that is on you. Okay? The vendor will only provide the software and the guidance for the implementation. Okay? They're not going to provide the platform, but they will provide you with the guidance on how to implement that platform. But the cost of that platform is up to you. Again, web-based solution, you got front end where you have web servers, maybe you're running on either IIS or the LAMP platform, Apache maybe, or on your web servers. They would make recommendations on how to implement the platform. Okay? The software is the vendor's. The platform is your responsibility. What about the backend database? Like I said, products built with SQL Server as a backend database, they would provide you with the cost, the licensing cost of implementing their app, but it's on you to implement SQL Server, which means if they say, hey, high availability 2-node failover cluster with 2 replica AG, per core licensing, enterprise edition, that's on you. So you have to factor that in. And we're not just talking about the cost as far as capital expenditures, meaning the upfront cost of implementing a solution, okay? Because that's what we see initially. Let's say, oh, you're going to need like $1.2 million for the hardware, software, the licensing and implementation costs, and the man-hours rather. But we're not talking about the operations and maintenance cost associated with this. Sure, your application vendor would provide you with the cost associated with maintenance and support for their app. What about the databases? Okay, this is where you have to have proper support for your databases now that they're in a high availability solution, because you want to prevent outages from happening. So either you would get a support contract from a third party if your application vendor is not providing that, a managed services provider, a contracting company or a consulting company, or Microsoft. That is a cost outside of the app. And you have to be ready and be prepared for that. Of course, as a technical operator, DBA, sysadmin, we don't really care about that because it's the finance people who need to take care of that. But you have to really look into the life cycle of the entire platform when it comes to cost. How many people on the team, our team, are capable of supporting this? Do we have the skills? Do we have the capabilities? Do we even know about this product? Okay, that is part of the cost. So now you have to bring people in. That's also one of the reasons why every job posting out there for SQL Server DBAs now has always on capabilities as a job requirement for the skills, meaning you have to have worked with always on availability groups as part of it, because again, vendors are making recommendations on an HA solution for SQL Server. This is their default recommendation, and now you have to support it. Okay, so those are the three things that you have to really think about when it comes to vendor recommendations for SQL Server high availability solutions, and what they're not telling you. Okay, they're not telling you that product support is not the same as HA solution support. Okay, typically, best effort, they'll do the best they can for supporting the high availability solution for your SQL Server databases. Second is that vendor recommended best practices do not magically apply to you. Okay, you have to evaluate those recommended best practices, whether or not they make sense to you, so that you can pick and choose which ones do make sense and replace those that don't make sense and come up with your own, or maybe even eliminate it if it doesn't really make sense. And the third one is that the app costs do not include HADR solution cost. Okay, the app focuses mostly on the app as far as licensing and implementation costs, but when it comes to HA solution, HADR, they take care of the software and the licensing and the implementation, but the platform, the cost is something that you have to bear, or your company has to bear. So you have to reevaluate the cost of implementing a high availability solution. And again, this is not to say that you do not implement a high availability solution, because businesses are constantly evolving, and this is now a part of your requirement. Okay? It's not a nice to have like back in the days. It's not a nice to have. Now it's mandatory, especially if you're working or you're in an industry that demands it. It's part of the regulation requirements that you have to have it. So it's no longer a nice to have, it's a must. So you have to really think about this and prepare so that you'll be ready for implementing a high availability solution that meets your business requirement, not just because the vendor made recommendations on it. Okay, this wraps up kind of like the series. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go back to some of the videos that I've covered, some of the episodes, past episodes on kind of like the vendor dilemma series, so that you can prepare for whenever a vendor makes recommendations on high availability solutions for your SQL Server databases. Okay, that is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. tune in again next time for another episode. I really appreciate some of the people who are sending emails, DMs about topics that are relevant to them. In fact, these are kind of like some of the ideas that I'm getting and infusing in some of these topics that I'm covering in the Practical SQL Server HA show. All right. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I consider Thursday the beginning of my weekend. I don't know, maybe I'm just too lazy, or maybe I just like to enjoy life more. But enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again in the next